This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. A few years ago, the Me Too movement went viral when women used social media to acknowledge they had experienced sexual harassment or assault, and they called for changes, starting in the workplace. But listen to disgraced New York Governor Andrew Cuomo on Tuesday describe his behavior. These comments were part of Cuomo's resignation announcement after the New York Attorney General investigated and concluded he had harassed 11 women.
I do hug and kiss people casually, women and men. I have done it all my life. It's who I've been since I can remember. In my mind, I've never crossed the line with anyone. But I didn't realize the extent to which the line has been redrawn.
One person shared on Twitter, I guess Cuomo skipped the annual sexual harassment training required for all New York State employees. And that brings us to our show today. Since 2019, Connecticut law requires most employers to provide sexual harassment prevention training. But do these programs really work? Do they change workplace culture? Today, Where We Live, we hear from two guests who know the law and what research shows about these programs and their effectiveness. And we want to hear from you, too. Have you undergone mandatory sexual harassment prevention training? Do you think they've helped your workplace? You can join us, 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can share a comment on our Facebook page or find us on Twitter at Where We Live. My first guest is on Zoom, Marcia McCormick. She's an employment law professor at St. Louis University. Marcia, welcome to our show.
Thanks. I'm excited to be here.
Now, before we dig in, I just wanted to get your reaction when you heard Andrew Cuomo's comments on Tuesday.
So his reaction is very similar to the reactions of a lot of, and usually it's men, who are accused of having engaged in harassing behavior. And it's not just sex harassment, it's also harassment on other protected classes. But the general defense is, well, the rules have changed. Something is new, and I didn't really intend for my actions to be taken the wrong way, but they were, and it's because the rules have changed. And so that sort of, deflects any responsibility, but also is probably not accurate in terms of what the rules are and what they've been for quite a long time.
That's right. We're going to be talking about the federal and state laws that are in place to prevent this kind of behavior from happening. So let's start there, Marcia. When did we start to really see companies and other workplaces start to offer sexual harassment prevention training?
Well, the training actually has been around for a pretty long time, certainly since at least the mid-'80s in some form at big companies. And maybe even for some of them in the late 70s and early 80s. But the training really picked up speed in the late 90s when the Supreme Court issued a couple of decisions about why training might help employers not be liable for harassment claims brought by their employees.
Oh, that's interesting. We heard from Hillary, who tweeted, appreciative that you're doing this segment. When we individualize the problem, when it's a structural issue, we'll never eliminate this behavior. Plus, the approach is legalistic versus ethical and moral. She goes on to say, it's a cover your rear for the institution or business that has no intention of changing. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think that's right. And in fact, the most effective ways to prevent harassment are really structural. It's about having lots of women in the workforce and women in core leadership positions. And those kinds of structural things really do make a difference in the culture and make harassment less likely on the basis of sex. And similar things happen for race when we have more diversity in race and leadership positions. But I do want to sort of push back a tiny bit on the moral versus legalistic. And I'm not just doing that because I'm a lawyer. I totally agree that the training is really legalistic in ways that are not productive. But one of the challenges in viewing anti-discrimination as a moral issue is that then that allows for sort of a two sides debate. And generally speaking, there has been a long debate actually about anti-discrimination as a moral issue. And many activists have resisted a moral framing in large part because that means that there aren't remedies if it's simply a moral issue.
We want to hear from you, especially we know the Me Too movement really took off in 2017, and yet we're still seeing both high-profile cases and other small cases around the country when we think about sexual harassment and assault, whether it's in the workplace, in the military, on college campuses. And so when we hear Andrew Cuomo say that he didn't realize the lines have been redrawn. I mean, come on. Unless he's been living under a rock, it's been pretty obvious. But we want to hear from you if you've had to do these prevention trainings at your workplace. Do you think that they've made a difference in your on your job or in the place that you work? You can join us 888-720-9677. Again, that's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Marcia, you mentioned that these programs have been around for starting in the late 70s and 80s. And so what were some of the cases that were heard that prompted companies to respond?
Well, there were some very early cases in the circuit courts, first involving race-based harassment and then involving sex harassment. And one of the first Supreme Court cases to consider the issue is a case called Meritor Bank versus Vinson. And in that case, the Supreme Court recognized that an abusive environment is itself discriminatory, and an environment where a supervisor requires subordinates to engage in sexual activity with them or continues to ask them, even if there's no economic effect, that environment alone is discriminatory. And in that case, the court left open the question of when it is exactly that an employer was going to be liable for that supervisor's conduct. Because one of the sort of things that people don't realize maybe about anti-discrimination law is that it's not the person who discriminates under at least federal law who ends up being the defendant in these cases and having to pay damages and things like that. It's the employer who employs the person who engages in the conduct.
Mm. And we'll be talking more about Connecticut law coming up. We'll be hearing from an attorney that's based in our state. And so before COVID, of course, we think about these workshops or trainings that took place in person. And so as they've developed and as time has gone on, I mean, who are the people that are in workplaces telling employees, telling leadership, these are the laws and this is why you need to follow them? And what do these trainings look like?
So the trainings have gotten better, but I'll go with sort of the archetypal, not so great trainings. And those are usually spearheaded by HR professionals, maybe with general counsel or outside counsel. And in fact, management side firms have often, or in the past at least, have marketed their services for training for their employer clients. And usually the training involves a description of the law, and then maybe some role playing or scenarios that display some kind of harassing behavior, and then maybe an explanation of why that might violate the law or at least violate the employer's policy. And they're supposed to be kind of interactive, but the extent of their interaction is usually question and answer, or occasionally where people are asked to actually role play.
That must be uncomfortable.
Oh my gosh, super uncomfortable. So one of the things that I do with my students, I use Google image searches a lot. And this isn't exactly like the training, but and my students have done this at their workplaces too. But I ask them to look for a picture of with the search terms of, sexual harassment. And the stock photos that come back all look really uncomfortable. Usually they're a young woman sitting at a desk with a clearly masculine hand on her shoulder and her sort of cringing away, or, the guy standing too close or something like that. And the pictures themselves are kind of cringeworthy. And so are the role-playing actions often.
Now, I mentioned before COVID, we'd be sitting in a room learning about the law at these trainings. And now there are several companies out there that provide these online modules, and they sound something like this.
The goal of this course is to give you the skills to be a positive influence in the workplace. We will be taking a close look at issues like harassment, discrimination, and retaliation, which affect people in organizations everywhere.
Marcia, is it any wonder for these online modules that people may not really be paying attention or kind of tune out?
Yeah, it's pretty common because that sounds really legalistic. Although I'll tell you that is a lot better viewing from the sense that at least it's looking at discrimination in a way as a cultural thing, and all of those kinds of discrimination together. It's better than simply treating harassment alone.
Again, you're hearing Marcia McCormick here on Where We Live. She's an employment law professor at St. Louis University. As we talk more about efforts in place in workplaces for many years, especially after the Me Too movement, has been heightened the awareness of sexual harassment prevention training at workplaces. We want to hear from you if you've done these trainings, if you feel like you've learned something, or if it has made any impact on your workplace culture. 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. So, Marcia, you mentioned not just focusing on laws on harassment, but thinking about the different classes of protection. Can you walk us through that?
Yeah, so harassment is just another kind of discrimination. So any protection that exists for a particular identity characteristic or protected conduct, like filing a charge or asserting your rights in the workplace, any one of those can form the basis of a harassment claim. And so you can have harassment on the basis of sex, race, color, national origin, religion, age, disability status. All of those are covered by federal law. And the states have mostly interpreted their anti-discrimination laws the same way.
When we talk about discomfort when people have to go through these trainings, what does the evidence show, research into these programs about, how it impacts behaviors?
So traditional anti-harassment training, especially the legalistic kind, especially the kind that focuses on sexual harassment itself or alone, there's no evidence that it is effective. And in fact, it can be counterproductive. One of the things that can happen is that by talking about stereotypes, for example, that can prime stereotypes in the minds of the people participating in the training and make it more likely after the training that they will act on the basis of those stereotypes. It can also make supervisors afraid and other employees too afraid of accidentally, in sort of Governor Cuomo's terms, harassing someone. And so reducing their interactions with people who are different from them. And so, for example, you might think of a few years ago, one of the terms in the news was the Pence rule, that Vice President Pence refused to be alone with a female, another woman without his wife present. And you can imagine in a workplace where mentoring is really important, where a lot of that mentoring might happen outside of the four walls of the office or even in somebody's office with the door closed. If male supervisors are afraid of those interactions with women, they're not going to mentor women. They're not going to promote women. They may not even hire women. It's just safer to hire people like them.
I was looking at the Institute for Women's Policy Research that found that at least 1/4 of women experience sexual harassment at the workplace. I'm wondering, what do we know about men who are treated this way?
We don't know a lot about men who are treated this way. There have been some surveys that suggest that harassment of men is broader than we might suspect. But there are real challenges to get at that kind of information. One of the challenges is that it really requires a broad climate survey, and not a lot of employers do that. That's one of the recommendations, actually, of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, is to engage in these climate surveys to try and measure the amount of harassment employees might experience. But also, I think it's really challenging for men to, one, recognize that what happened to them might be harassment, at least sexual harassment. And two, to even report it in a survey, but certainly not, it has to be really bad, generally speaking, for men to come forward and even tell their employers what's happening to them, because there's just such a stigma surrounding masculinity and being subject to some kind of harassment.
You know, I started the show off listening to Andrew Cuomo, that clip from his recorded comments on Tuesday. And we think about in the media these high-profile cases, these men who've been in power for some time. You know, these trainings really aren't relevant to them, right? Because this behavior has been part of them for so long. And you know, is someone sitting down with the Governor Cuomo when he's in office to say, you know, these are the laws, this is how you should follow them? It doesn't seem like that's happening.
Right. Well, and even if it's happening, there's a phenomenon, and again, the EEOC has talked about this, where in some workplaces there will be 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 men who are sort of stars. And even if they go through the harassment training, which they might not, it never really applies to them. It's never enforced against them. They're never sort of required to follow the same rules as other people, and they're protected. And so a lot of the stories that we've heard, especially in the tech world, involve those kinds of sort of superstar male people who just never seem to have to follow the rules.
Again, you're hearing Marcia McCormick here on Where We Live. She's an employment law professor at St. Louis University. As we talk about mandated sexual harassment prevention trainings in Connecticut and other states, most employers are required to provide these trainings, but we wanted to find out what they actually accomplish. And as Marcia says, the research shows they can be counterproductive. So what have you noticed at your workplace? Did they make a difference? We want to hear from you. 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. We'll be back after a short break.
I thought a hug and putting my arm around a staff person while taking a picture was friendly, but she found it to be too forward. I kissed a woman on the cheek at a wedding, and I thought I was being nice, but she felt that it was too aggressive. I have slipped and called people honey, sweetheart, and darling. I meant it to be endearing, but women found it dated and offensive. I said on national TV to a doctor wearing PPE and giving me a COVID nasal swab, "You make that gown look good." I was joking. Obviously, otherwise I wouldn't have said it on national TV. But she found it disrespectful.
You're listening to Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. That's Andrew Cuomo, governor of New York, for another 12 days. He announced his resignation after a 165-page investigation by the New York Attorney General, concluding he sexually harassed 11 women. He denies the women's allegations. Now, we're learning about laws that protect people in the workplace, and most states like Connecticut mandate sexual harassment prevention trainings. We're talking about these programs with my guest on Zoom, Marcia McCormick, professor of law at St. Louis University. She's a specialist in employment law. We wanted to hear from you as well if you've undergone these mandated sexual harassment training prevention programs. what they've been like? Do you think they make a difference in your workplace? Laura's calling in from Guilford. Hi, Laura. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
So what has been your experience with these trainings?
Well, we just did a training about 2 months ago where we had to learn what was going to be offensive, basically, not just sexually harassment focused, but also ageism and other things like that, and diversity and racial equity. We're doing a big diversity and equity push at work. However, the big focus on sexual harassment, and the training focused on levels of harassment from green all the way up to red. And so now it's almost become comical in the workplace. If somebody makes a comment, we'll be like, oh, that's in the red. And so it's become funny. And I feel like it's kind of taken an emphasis off the importance of the training and some of the parts that I personally have experienced as a woman in the workplace. And so it was just kind of an interesting way. And I think when you had spoken to the fact that, or your guest, sorry, that when you put these stereotypes out there, people pay more attention to them. I think that is so, so accurate.
That's an interesting approach, green to red. Marcia McCormick. Yeah. Laura, thank you for describing that for us. Marcia, when I hear that, I think about, some of the ways that my children's elementary school teachers talk to them. Green is acceptable behavior and red, you might get sent to the principal's office.
Yeah, that is pretty. It is pretty similar, and I feel some sympathy for the people who are designing this training, and management and supervisors who probably mean well. But you're right; it really trivializes things to frame them that way, and does create an opportunity to make fun of the training itself, which leads to sort of making fun of taking it seriously when these things happen to you.
When we think about the people who are harassing or bullying at the workplace, we probably already touched on this a little bit, but when we think about these mandatory trainings, do they get the message that this behavior is okay, or is it completely, this is how they are, and they'll just be careful about who they might be joking around with if it's, as they say, a joke?
Right. And I think that's a really common strategy to deploy when a person has been accused of or called on their behavior as harassing, and Governor Cuomo did it. I was joking. I wouldn't have said this on national television if I wasn't joking. And that puts the burden then on the person who says, no, this was discriminatory behavior. And the actor's like, well, I didn't mean it. You're just too sensitive, really. And so it trivializes the conduct. It makes it so they're not really responsible for it. And it, sends the message to the person who's subject to it that there's something wrong with them. There's a great line that is sort of used in these circumstances, and it's a little offensive itself, but it's repeated in the movie North Country, which I highly encourage people to watch if they want to watch a movie about harassment and the harm of it. And the line is that when a woman particularly accuses a man of sexual harassment and there's litigation, one of the defenses is called the nuts and sluts defense. Essentially, if that she either imagined what happened, or is overly sensitive, or she invited the conduct.
Wow. Mary called in just to share. She worked in architecture and engineering for many years. She was always outnumbered, and she was always seen as too young, too female, and now too old. And she remembers the sexual harassment training back in the 90s, and then she was harassed by colleagues for being female after that. So that speaks to the point that you raised, Marcia, that it doesn't generally cause any change in behavior, and it actually sometimes solidifies the stereotypes and the behaviors and the uncalled for comments after the fact.
Yeah, there's actually a lot of psychological literature on that very effect in experimental and real life situations.
I'm sorry that happened to you, Mary, who wanted to share that with us. Let's talk about some of the tools for people who are not the harassers, but people that might see that kind of behavior or have experienced that. And when we think about these training programs, What are they learning in terms of how to report it or how to diffuse a scenario or something that's happening right in front of them?
Well, so those are sort of two separate questions that go to two separate goals that an employee or that the training might have. And I'm going to talk about what they might do in the moment. Okay. So one of the things that seems promising in the research on this issue is something called bystander training, and it was originally sort of created in the context of street harassment. And the idea of bystander intervention or bystander training is that you help people who are seeing something respond in the moment to stop what's going on and to sort of rescue the person who is the target of the harassment. And it can be even something so small as pretending you know someone, interrupting to say, "Hey, how are you?" to the person who's being harassed. Or confronting the person who is the actor who's doing the harassment and telling them that what they're doing isn't okay. And so one of the virtues of bystander, there are a number of them, but one of them is that like I said, it interrupts the conduct in the moment. It relieves the tension of what's happening to the person that they may be very uncomfortable with and not know how to react. And it allows for, a witness to sort of focus on the actor to help reinforce the message that what you just did really wasn't okay. And it also, one of the things that happens when people stand up for themselves in the context of discrimination is that they are viewed negatively. Even if we know what happened to them, saying something about it, expressing discomfort, those kinds of things actually cause retaliation against that person, and causes, not in a legal sense necessarily, but causes negative thoughts about that person. They're sort of viewed as a whiner. And so, for example, even women who do this training are to some extent retaliated against or resented for standing up for diversity or any of those kinds of things. And so when you don't have something at stake, but you're standing up for someone else, that doesn't happen. And so it's more effective in that way as well. Reporting is a slightly different issue, only because that's part of sort of a legalistic structure that the employer has instituted. That's part of its attempt usually to prevent and keep tabs on any harassment and stop it before it gets out of control. And that's usually helping people know how they should report it. It tends to be pretty formalistic and legalistic, and there are identified people and there's a process. And there are guarantees connected with that.
Again, you're hearing Marcia McCormick here on Where We Live. She's an employment law professor at St. Louis University as we talk more about mandated sexual harassment prevention trainings in Connecticut and in other places. You can join us. We'd love to hear your experience and what your workplace culture is. 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Marcia, you talked about the people who are harassed and they end up reporting and then they are retaliated against and they're fearful of the outcome. Maybe that's why they don't step up to say something. And when we think about bystanders, that's also something on the minds of people at work, is how's management going to consider them or impact their standing in the company if they also stand up and say this is wrong?
Yeah, it's a very valid concern, and that's one of the reasons that very, very few people who experience harassment actually do report it. And so one of the, there's again a lot of research on this. If a woman or a person of color supports diversity generally, often that person can be penalized in performance reviews. So nothing, not even in the moment, not even a specific issue. It can seem really risky, but when white men do things like that, they're taken more seriously. It's viewed as a positive. But I think that the issues are slightly different when we're talking about reporting a particular thing you've seen in the moment involving someone else. There isn't as much evidence of backlash or retaliation in those circumstances, especially if it's a one-off kind of situation. Whereas a person talking about their own experience, coworkers resent it, supervisors resent it, and it sort of spills over into other aspects.
Again, we'd love to hear from you as we talk about mandated sexual harassment training prevention programs. The number 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. We're going to talk specifically about Connecticut law coming up in just a few minutes. But Marcia, I was thinking to sexual assault and harassment in the military. And for so long, there was a push to have independent investigators, people not within the military system, to look at these cases. And I'm wondering, when we think about, how companies are structured, maybe, are the HR people the best people to be handling this? So depending on, again, just the structure and the trainings that maybe even HR has taken. And I would assume it's probably cost prohibitive for companies to think about, outside people handling these kinds of issues when they pop up versus internal structure.
Yeah, I think that's right, that it is certainly more expensive. One of the challenges, and the accountability is going to potentially look very different. And that, too, might be a deterrent to a company using an outside investigator. I mean, the positives is that the process might look more legitimate. The negative might be that the employer might not really want what that outside investigator is going to recommend to happen.
Exactly. Thank you, Marcia. I was just curious about that as we hear about even how the U.S. military is responding to these allegations within its ranks. Again, you can join us, 888-720-9677, or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Joining our conversation now is Deb McKenna, attorney and partner at Hayber, McKenna, and Dinsmore, LLC. Deb, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me, Lucy.
So you're
good morning, Marcia.
Good morning.
You're based in Connecticut, and so I've mentioned a few times since 2019 there was the Time's Up law passed and signed into law in Connecticut that mandates sexual harassment prevention training, I think, for employers that have 3 or more employees. So can you talk about that expansion of the law and what that means exactly for companies?
Sure. So prior to 2019, the only folks who had to go through sexual harassment training under Connecticut law were folks who supervised, I think it was over 50 employees. And you only had to go through 2 hours of sexual harassment training once. So if you became a supervisor 10 years ago, that's maybe when you had your sexual harassment training, and that was it. With the expansion in the law, now all employees and the reason for the 3 or more employees is because our sexual harassment laws in Connecticut only cover employers who employ 3 or more employees. So it's linked to that. But now, if all employees have to go through sexual harassment training, it's still once. It's only 2 hours. And the employer is only required to provide periodic supplemental training, not less than once every 10 years. So that's how it's been expanded.
And so you represent people who've been harassed or abused in the workplace, Deb?
Yes, I do. My practice is devoted to advocating for the rights of workers in the workplace. And so for the past 25 years, that's what I've devoted my legal work to. I represent lots of folks who've experienced all sorts of discrimination, but many who have experienced sexual harassment.
We know the Me Too movement helped really heighten awareness and help some people actually feel comfortable talking about what they've experienced. I'm wondering, do you hear from more clients in your line of work that are comfortable stepping up and, following through with, their claims that they've been treated wrongly?
So I do think that the Me Too movement certainly helped bring folks who were reluctant in the past forward with their claims. In order to be able to bring a claim, a legal claim, you have to be willing to take certain steps and step forward and make it known that the harassment is unwelcome, that the conduct's unwelcome. And as Marcia was talking about earlier, with regards to some of these legalistic requirements, our law does expect employees to use company complaint procedures as part of the process of complaining.
You can join us 888-720-9677 or find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Gracie's calling in from West Haven. Gracie, what's been your experience?
Hi. Thank you for taking my call. Back in like the late 80s, I used to work in a lumberyard, Grossman's Lumberyard that's no longer here. And, as I worked up in the company, I ended up being head of customer service, which, being a female working in that field in the first place is just, there's all kinds of sexual harassment coming from all places. And so I was the head cashier, and people would ask me questions, and I'd give them an answer, and they would want me literally to go get some other man to come and answer it and mansplain it for them. But with that, we all had to wear name tags. And I started getting these harassing phone calls at work. People would ask for me by name and then would say, I want to do X, Y, and Z to you. And just really nasty, disturbing comments that were made. And eventually I never, like any other job that I had after that I had to wear a name tag, I never put my name on it. I was like, I refuse to put my name on there. But I'm just curious nothing ever was done by the company. And I'm not even sure exactly what they could have done to deal with that kind of harassment at work coming from like random customers. Or not even customers, just random people calling in and saying those kinds of things. And I feel like we've definitely made steps forward, but I feel like we're also stagnant, and some people are just, I wouldn't say dense. I think that they're just, because they might be guilty of some of that behavior, it's better to just brush it off as, it's just who I am, like Cuomo was saying. I've kissed people all my life. And just because you've done that all your life doesn't mean that it's right.
Exactly.
And now you're being called out for it. So now you have to face it.
Right. Gracie, thank you for calling in. I'm sorry that happened to you. Deb, did you want to respond to Gracie's point? Again, we can have all these trainings out there, but if people are this way for so long, if they're raised this way, if they think this is appropriate, are they ever going to get the message?
Thank you. And Gracie, I'm sorry you had to experience that. And first, before I answer your question, Lucy, just to Gracie's point about what an employer could do in that situation, an employer does have an obligation to provide you with a workplace that's free from harassment. So I don't know if Gracie had complained or not, but had she complained, there were steps that, as far as I would have argued, her employer could have done to ensure that she was not the person getting those phone calls, perhaps screening those phone calls, taking a stronger stance about how they're going to allow their employees to be treated. We do see that particularly in workplaces, service type of workplaces, restaurants, for example, right, where you're working in a customer service field. And it does not alleviate the employer's obligation to provide you as their employee with a workplace that's free from harassment. As to the point about whether or not how do you get to someone who has harassed or looked at the world through this lens for 20 or 30 years, I don't know that you're ever going to change that person's behavior. And so that means that the onus is on the employer to take strong steps against, and to ensure that they are not going to be an employer who tolerates this type of behavior. I do think we see a fair number of cases, right, where you have an older harasser, and, I don't believe that people all of a sudden start becoming sexual harassers at age 50 or 60, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a learned behavior. It means they've gotten away with it for a long period of time, and often because the employer themselves has turned a blind eye to it.
Mm. You're hearing Deb McKenna again here on Where We Live. She's an attorney and partner at Hayber, McKenna and Dinsmore, LLC. Marcia McCormick is also here, an employment law professor at St. Louis University. This is Where We Live. We're going to take a short break, and we'll continue talking about sexual harassment and steps to change workplace culture and even the way people have been raised, as we heard from our guests and our caller. Maybe it starts when your child is young. The appropriate way to respond to people and to be respectful of everyone. More after a short break. This is Where We Live on Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest today on the phone, Deb McKenna, attorney and partner at Hayber, McKenna and Dinsmore, LLC. On Zoom with us, Marcia McCormick, who's a professor of employment law at St. Louis University. Deb, I wanted to go back to you because we were talking about, some of the clients that you have, the types of complaints. And I'm wondering, when we look at industry broadly, are there particular sectors where you see this kind of behavior persisting?
So I do. I think that you see it persisting in the restaurant industry. You also see it persisting in more male-dominated, or traditionally, I should say, male-dominated fields like finance, and to a certain extent in the medical field as well. I think that those are places where there are, still power imbalances are tend to be the areas where we see it the most.
So walk us through how your cases typically start and when, you get involved.
Sure. So, typically I get contacted by someone who has been experiencing some act in the workplace. Maybe it's maybe it's recently happened, or maybe something has been happening over a period of months that finally leads them to reach out to a lawyer. If they're still within the workplace, there's usually a number of steps that we recommend that they take before filing a complaint. It goes back to being able to put them in the best position to challenge the sexual harassment. And some of these steps can be somewhat difficult. But it is how our case law has developed. So, for example, in order to prove a case of sexual harassment, you first have to show the conduct at issue was unwelcome. Often that means telling the actual harasser to their face, or, through an email or text, or conveying in some way that whatever the behavior is that's being engaged in is unwelcome. And that can be really daunting for folks. But it's important that you do that because oftentimes the employer will turn around and make the arguments that we're hearing from even, Andrew Cuomo, right? I was joking. I didn't realize that it was offensive. I didn't know this is how I've always been, right? And so by first conveying that behavior is unwelcome, it takes any of that uncertainty out of that. The other thing that we suggest that folks do is to document the harassment, make notes, email yourself, save any text messages. I get a lot of calls now about sexual harassment involving text messaging. And folks have a mistaken impression that those text messages we can receive, we can obtain them through a subpoena. So sometimes they'll delete them, but it's important to save them no matter how offensive they might be, back them up. That's important evidence, voicemails, emails, things like that. Then we also suggest that the person who's being harassed get a copy of the company's harassment policy, because as Marcia was talking about earlier in the hour, our laws have set up certain structures where employees are expected to know the harassment policy and complain about the behavior. And again, those can be difficult steps. But, it is important to do that. And in fact, if you have a company handbook that tells you how to complain about harassment, it's important that you follow it. So a lot of times my initial calls are giving guidance as to how to protect yourself best in that workplace. Once you've done that, If the harassment is continuing or if your employer is not responding to your complaint, then you can, consider taking your legal action. In Connecticut, you have 300 days to file a claim alleging sexual harassment against your employer. To start that process, you can file with the Connecticut Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities. You could also choose to file with the EEOC, but my personal preference is to file with the CHRO because you get more information through that process. For example, your employer will have to answer your complaint. You get a chance to comment on their answer as part of the process. You have to go through one of these two administrative agencies before you can ever file your case in court. So, for example, you either have to go through the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities or you have to go through the EEOC if you think that down the road you're going to sue your employer for sexual harassment. The only caveat to that is if you've experienced sexual assault, which unfortunately seems to be an increasing number of the calls that we're dealing with involve some form of sexual assault. The sexual assault claims on their own can be brought in court, but it's still important to kind of go through this whole process with the commission. And
Deb, we just have a couple of minutes left, but thank you for walking us through those steps. Marcia McCormick, you're still with us. We heard from the caller earlier about, what is really effective. And, we talk about workplace culture and these prevention trainings in the workplace, but maybe these conversations need to happen when children are in school. What's your take?
Yeah, I totally agree. There's evidence actually that exactly the kind of workplace harassment that we see is actually the kind of schoolyard and school harassment that we see. And one of the links, at least for harassment with sexual content, is the lack of standards for comprehensive sex education in this country. And not learning it from a very young age about consent, what you can say no to, what other people can say no to, is a big step.
Well, it's been a really interesting conversation. Thank you both. Again, Marcia McCormick is an employment law professor at St. Louis University. Thank you, Marcia, for your time today.
Well, thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
And Deb McKenna, attorney and partner at Hayber, McKenna in Dinsmore. I'd like to say this is the last time we'll be doing a show on this topic, but we've done several over the last few years, and it is still relevant today. Deb, thank you for your time.
Thank you for having me.
I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Tess Terrible produced today's show. Kat Pastor is our technical producer. And tomorrow we have this show coming up. How much would you pay to be the owner of a funny tweet? What about an animation of a flying cat whose body is a Pop-Tart? Tomorrow we dive into the world of NFTs, a way to own digital art that's taken the internet and the art world by storm. We'll also take a look at cryptocurrency. Are you crypto curious? I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. As always, thanks for listening.